Hello folks, this is David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com, your pub chess bluffer, reporting on the latest game between myself and my regular opponent, Dr. M. We played a game on Wednesday, the 6th of November 2019. I was white and therefore I opened with d4 as usual. And my opponent responded with d5. One moment, what's going on here? d5. And I came back with c4, so we're entering the Queen's Gambit. And then he gave me c6, so we are now in the Slav Defence. And here I did my regular third move, as recommended by my man John Watson, knight to c3. And here we had knight to f6. And now here you can see Lichess is recommending that white take the d5 pawn, which is in fact what I did, although it is not one of the moves that John Watson chooses in his repertoire. And I've been trying to learn and study his repertoire, but I don't always follow the repertoire, mostly because I simply forget what I'm supposed to be doing. So I'll just show you what I did, and then I'll show you what John Watson recommends in this situation. So what I did, as Lichess shows, is perfectly good. It's to take that pawn there. So chop off that d5 pawn, and we get into this situation here. But what John Watson recommends in a chess repertoire, it's called an opening chess repertoire for white, is that instead of taking that pawn, white more quietly moves the pawn to e3, opening up a channel for the bishop and making a nice pawn chain there. And there's a pattern which I call, for memory purposes, even though it doesn't work, it doesn't seem to work yet, the Enola Gay. This is the pattern which plays out in John Watson's variation. Bishop to f5, and then at this stage we now take, and there's a double take, the c pawns exchange on the d5 square. And then this is my Enola Gay move. It's just a memory system based on a number, associating numbers with letters. Enola Gay flies out to b3. And what she's doing there is looking at this pawn here, though of course it's protected by the queen and the knight, but especially targeting this undefended pawn down here, which then gives black, poses black a problem, which it seems that the better players resolve by ignoring that pawn, letting it go if white wishes to take it, in order to build up a pawn chain or create a pawn chain and open up a line for the black bishop, the black squared bishop, to move into action. So that is the recommended set of moves by John Watson. But to go back to what happened in our game, the c takes d5, c takes d5, and then I brought out my bishop. I'm looking at developing my bishop on the f4 square outside of the pawn chain. And Lichess, although Lichess didn't actually recommend that move, Lichess does not disapprove of the move. It's a perfectly fine developing move. My opponent gave us g6. Now I do the little e3 move. And we have the fianchettoed bishop. All is fine so far in this game. I developed my bishops. I developed both bishops before my g knight. That's fine in this situation. It's not a problem. Now we have the rather surprising move here, but it's a move that you do see in these games. Queen to b6, and I remember that there are certain games, certain setups where the two queens face off on, I think it's the b file. And so I thought that is what I would do. I'd face off queen versus queen. Also, if the queen retreats, it does give me it adds some weight to the attack on the center, as both my queen and my knight are now eyeing the d5 pawn, challenging for the center. I was kind of expecting my opponent to take the queen, but he chose not to and developed his knight. This is leading, it's slightly increasing white's advantage in not chopping off the queens there. And let's have a look at another option, which let's see, where are we? We have the queen to b3. No, the queen to b6. Sorry, let's play through Leicest's recommended option here, which is to, again, ignore the, not bother to defend the undefended b pawn, but instead to focus attention on this rather weak central pawn here. It's weak in the current setup. I know that's not where we're going. Here we go. So bishop to f3. And then we see if the queen takes the queen, so the queen doesn't take the queen. If the queen takes the pawn, we simply continue developing. So now what white has in exchange for that b pawn is a lead in development, a developmental lead, which maintains white's advantage. Well, with further analysis, Leicester has whittled down that advantage, and with even more analysis, it has come back up again. So white maintains a small advantage, ignoring that b pawn, letting the queen come down and have it, and choosing to develop instead. When I set up this game, Leicester was recommending that black castle at this stage, but then later, after further thought, I don't know if we'll see it and do it now. In fact, I'll just do the move that was recommended later after deeper thought, which was to develop the bishop out to f5. And then if white castles, and we get this e6 move in, building up that pawn chain. But you can see white is maintaining an advantage. And then there's this nice little move, which I doubt I would have, I don't know if I'd have seen it or not. I doubt that I would have seen it, not really wanting to break up my defense, my defenses in front of the king, the pawn defense. But the bishop is rather constricted in this setup. And the only place for the bishop to go with the hope of an equal exchange is down to e4. Now, I did something different for the sake of showing you the risk that this bishop is under if he doesn't go to e4. Let's say the bishop wants to come down here and attack the queen, which I think is a likely option at the kind of 1500 level of chess. If the bishop comes down here, you can see there's almost an immediate loss for black, because white simply sidesteps the attempt, and it now puts the queen very much at risk. Leicester recommends that the queen escape. But what happens if black doesn't see the danger to the queen and simply decides to castle instead? Here's what happens. The rook comes across, and now the queen really has to retreat and only has one retreat square. And in retreating out there, it will be the fall of the c2 bishop. I didn't take the analysis any further because that is a clear winning advantage for white. Okay, so none of that happened in our game because I placed my queen opposite black's queen, and black developed his knight to his b knight to d7. I then developed a knight, and we both castled. And so as we enter the middle game, there's a bishop here which is rather stuck. But apart from that, we're pretty much entering the middle game now. The first big blunder, well, big mistake happens on black's part. Black causes a big weakness in his position with what looks like a perfectly reasonable move, because it's a very common and usual move for black to make, but not under these circumstances. And that is the little e6 move. At the time, just after the game, when we were commenting and did a quick bit of post-game analysis, I said it looked like a perfectly reasonable move to make, as it's strengthening pawn, well, creating the pawn chain and strengthening the defenses of the d5 pawn. However, in moving to e6, Lichess doesn't like this at all, and there's a very good reason for it. It's because it creates a weakness on this square here. You have to keep your eye on this square. True, it's being protected by the queen, but that is not enough. With the e-pawn on e7, this d6 square is being protected. But as soon as the pawn moves, it opens a nice juicy hole here, and you can see which of White's pieces can aim for that hole. It's the knight, and a knight in there on d6 is a very dangerous knight indeed. So that is what Lichess is recommending, and I'm pleased to say that is what I did. Where are we going with this? I hopped my knight up there into b5. Now, clearly, this square here does need some more defense. We have here White now has his bishop looking at this square and his knight looking at the square. So something needs to be done to protect this square from the knight. The knight coming in there is very dangerous. And in fact, Lichess has a rather good answer, is to move the knight down here to protect that square. However, that did not happen in our game. What happened instead was a distraction. Now, we already have quite a nice advantage for White here. And with an a5 move, the advantage for White jumps up further. So this a5 move, Black is clearly aiming to dislodge the queen, but it creates, it does not do anything to shore up Black's central defenses here, and White now has access to this hole here. This is another hole White can exploit. Again, that bishop's reach comes all the way down here. Excuse me. The bishop's reach comes all the way down along that diagonal. So the White knight could also hop in there and attack the rook. And well, it's getting very sticky for Black. In response to a5, I don't move my queen. Instead, I send my bishop down to d6 to attack the rook and to occupy that nice, juicy central square. I've talked about the knight occupying it, but as I was looking at the board, I thought it'd be a nice place to put the bishop. What I want to talk about in a moment is a beautiful missed opportunity. I can see that I can probably win a rook and have a favorable exchange here at some stage. What I'm looking at, the reason I moved the bishop in there, is that if the rook moves moves across to here to e8, then I can move my knight into c7, and we have a nice fork here. At some stage, it needs some preparatory work. The queen is eyeing an undefended. If I move the knight, the queen will be eyeing an undefended bishop. So I knew I had something here, but it needed a bit of preparation. It needed to be set up. However, I moved my bishop in to see if I can dislodge that rook and put him onto a nice target square for White. And what happened? Interestingly, my opponent ignored that in order to attack the queen and kick the queen off this square here. I talked in our post-game analysis about the fight for the agenda, which is something that Silman talks about in one of his books. Wait a minute, the reassess your chess. Jeremy Silman talks about the fight for the agenda. So I'm trying to force the agenda in the center. but my opponent is now trying to force the agenda into his favor by booting my queen off of her square. However, although Lichess recommends that I move my queen to c2, and it probably would have been a slightly better square if Lichess says so, then we can't really disagree. However, I chose to move my queen up to b4 so that I would be offering support to that bishop and also strengthening that diagonal down there. And that then in turn frees up the knight, or it has the potential of freeing up the knight, depending on what would happen with this queen eyeing this queen here. So I'm trying to get a bit closer to setting up this advantageous set of exchanges in the center. What happened next? Well, things got a bit better for me when my opponent, things got a bit better for me, I think, when my opponent moved his queen away from b6 to back home to d8, and you can see Lichess doesn't like this at all, because it really makes life easier. This queen, my queen, is now free, not under attack at all down here. So the queen here is a nice anchor for my position, with my bishop and my knight going in there to cause some mayhem. This is where I missed a trick, because I've been setting up this position for a favorable exchange, and I've been focused on winning a rook for a minor piece. Now, I'm aware that, I was aware that the queen, the black queen, was also getting into some trouble, but I didn't quite realize how much trouble the black queen was in. So I'll show you what I did, and then I'll show you what I should have done. What I did still led to a favorable exchange, but I could have done something much stronger. So this is what I thought. I won't just grab the rook for a bishop here, because I can attack the queen. I can fork them. I've got my queen here supporting the bishop, so I'll just move the bishop one square up to fork the rook and the bishop, the rook and the queen, and see what the queen does. And the queen moved back out to a5 to attempt to exchange queens, to resolve the whole position by exchanging queens, at which point, seeing that my bishop would continue to protect my queen, I decided to take the rook first with my bishop. And I did it in a pub chess, in the spirit of the pub chess bluffer, thinking that if my opponent was not quick, not too sharp at this point, he might make a nice blunder and put me into a better position. And his blunder, which I haven't set up, so I'll do it now, the blunder would go like this. He decides to grab the queen, and you can see it's a complete blunder. It's now totally losing because it gets my bishop off the hook. Bishop comes back to take the queen, and it's pretty much game over for black at that stage, because he's lost a queen and a rook for a queen. So I'm a whole rook up in that situation. But although I attempted this little bit of pub chess bluffery, my opponent was equal to it. And what happened here? When I took his bishop, he took my bishop with his bishop, keeping and making sure that that bishop could not escape in that way. And then I took his queen, and he took my queen with his rook, which was fine for me because I simply moved my rook onto c1 to attack this unguarded and immobile bishop. My opponent saw what to do, as recommended by Lichess. He moved his knight across. But let's come back to the beginning of that situation to show you what I should have done better. I've benefited from the exchange. I've swapped off my bishop for a rook, and the two queens are off the table, so off the board. So things are looking pretty good for me. But it could have been even better if I had spotted it. So there's a reason why Lichess does not like that queen to d8 move. Here's the queen here. White has a clear advantage, but it's not yet a devastating advantage. When the queen moves back, it does become a devastating advantage, and here's why. You can see what Lichess is recommended. Move your knight into c7, Lichess is screaming. And when you do that, you can see the advantage continues extending in White's favor. Now, it appears that the knight is attacking the rook over here, and it appears that the rook can simply move out of the way. The queen is trapped, however. The queen cannot move, cannot escape. And if one route out of trouble is trouble, whatever happens for black, might be to let the rook go and advance the knight so that the queen could escape. But let's follow Lichess's recommendation and see what happens. So the rook comes out to a7, and now we get this rook, the f rook comes into c1. What's happening with this f rook down here? Well, again, as before, we need to, before we can execute these wonderful moves, we have to support our pieces. So the rook on c1 is offering much needed support to the knight, so that the trap against the queen can be sprung. Here's what I mean. So there's an advance of the pawn. We stop the pawn in its tracks like so. Something else. Oh, that's right. This pawn here moves so that the rook can attack the knight, but it's already too late. You can see what Lichess is recommending. The trap will be sprung. Now the queen cannot escape. So the only thing that black can hope for is limited damage by taking as much of white stuff off the board as possible, but it still will not be enough for black to regain equality in any way at all. So the queen takes c7, the rook takes c7, the rook takes c7, and here, although Lichess recommends a retreat of the bishop to attack that rook again, I decided to play it through where the bishop grabs the rook to just to take another big gun off the table in a favorable exchange. Now, of course, it does mean the queen must retreat, but I think that's fine. The queen retreats down to e1, and white has built up a massive advantage. However, I did not do that, as I said. So we had this situation, which I talked about just a minute ago, and I brought my a1 rook to c1 to attack the bishop, and black moved knight to b6, and then I followed that move, moving in my knight to that lovely e5 square. Once again, there's a hole here. There's a whole big hole. So black became very weak on the black squares because of the setup. Black became very weak on the black squares. The black squared bishop was fianchettoed, but it wasn't able to exert any influence at all. And because it was stuck in a corner, or stuck on g7 with traffic in the way, it caused a great weakness when black moved the e2 pawn to e3, opening up lots of holes on the black squares for white to exploit. So the Easy Chess Tips message for today is to go very careful in pay attention to your squares. To when you move a pawn, you might be strengthening a pawn chain, or you might be creating a pawn chain, but every time you move a pawn, the two squares that it was protecting become weaker. And the weakening can be disastrous if it opens up what's called a hole for a white knight, or for a knight to exploit, the opponent's knight to exploit. That's exactly what happened in this game, and it's happening again. Here there is a knight able to occupy the center with no resistance at all. So we have d7. Now, this again is something else we need to talk about, which is that white is ahead in material. White has 2 rooks, a bishop and 2 knights, and black has 1 rook, 2 bishops and 2 knights. I think there's equality in the pawns, but white is at a clear positional advantage and a clear material advantage. And at this stage, if you're offering to swap off pieces as black, your disadvantage is only going to increase, unless in doing so you can create a very dynamic position on the board. Here, in attempting to release your bishop, the black's bishop, all it does is invite white to happily swap off equal pieces. And that is what I did, and it's what Lichess is recommending. We had this little swap off here, and so the more pieces that come off the board, the more it favors white's position, because white has that material advantage and also white has a positional advantage. If you compare, for example, rooks, white has his rook on an open file. That rook is dynamic and active. Black's rook is hemmed in over here, and the white knight is protected by the bishop down here. So the position is much better for white, and white has a significant material advantage. Okay, let us continue. So what I decided to do is not a Lichess recommended move, was before I start moving towards the black king, I want to solidify my position. I don't really want to get into a position where this pawn is threatening to promote. So I decided to take a move to solidify the position in the corner down there. So the a3 move, which I don't regret doing at all. Lichess doesn't like it, but I don't think it mattered. I don't think it caused me any problems. It may simply have slowed down the process of winning. Black retreats the rook, looking for a way to get the rook back into action. I then decide to start an initiative on the king side. You can see that Lichess pretty much wants to do that as well. I led with Harry the H pawn, and again, this suitably opened up things for me. Now, there is a fairly easy answer that Lichess is recommending. When h4 comes in, h5 black will often reply with h5 to stop that advance, but black didn't in this case, because this comes back to the theme of agendas. Black has a new agenda and wanted to push it, which I think is a good thing to try and do. Black has seen that white has an undefended piece, and that effectively means that this pawn here is not really doing much work to defend that pawn, because in a pawn exchange, if this pawn comes down here and takes, then taking back will lose the bishop, as the now well-placed rook would come crashing down and take the bishop. So the good thing about this is that my opponent is thinking several moves ahead, looking at these patterns. This is a great mark of progress. These videos are all about helping my opponent and myself. I'm also an improving player, in no way an expert, and anybody watching to improve at this basic level, to start developing a vision for chess several moves ahead by looking at the patterns, finding those weaknesses and thinking about how you can exploit those weaknesses. So that is black's agenda in the center. And so black is kind of ignoring what I do on the wing in order to push his agenda in the center. At the same time, I am ignoring what black wants to do in the center, because I think my agenda will prevail. I have the advantage, I have a positional advantage, and I think I can prevail in pursuing my agenda. So it's the battle of agendas is back on the agenda. So here we go with my move. Pursuing my agenda on the wing, I keep going with h5, and my opponent keeps going with the e5 move. And I decide to take ignoring Lichess's recommendation, I decide to push ahead, trying to open up the position in front of the black king. And open up it does, because my opponent... So now what happens is my opponent excuse me, has been pushing his agenda. Now might be an interesting time to continue pushing, though I don't really recommend it. If my opponent were to take that pawn like so, he'd probably be losing, because you get this check in here. But were I to panic, which is quite possible, and take that pawn back with my pawn, it would be a disaster. He would take my bishop and gain an advantage. So, to my surprise, my opponent took back the pawn. So I have forced my opponent over to my agenda by taking the g6 pawn. It forces my opponent to address my agenda by taking back that dangerous pawn. We just saw how dangerous it was. It could come in there and fork the rook and the king. It would get taken, but it would put the king in a rather dodgy situation. Anyway, so my opponent has had to delay or halt his ideas for the center and come over and deal with my attack on the wing. When that happens, I now bring my rook up to c7, which Lichess wanted to do a few moves ago, when I instead did my little stopping move down here. I bring my rook into c7, getting your rook on your opponent's seventh row, or if you're black, getting your rook down onto your opponent's second row is always a good thing to do if you can manage to do it. We now have the attempt to regain the initiative in the center. E takes d4, but as you can see, Lichess recommends the simple answer to avoid, and this is actually what I had seen. I'm pleased to say I had seen this, and I did that. Avoid the advantage losing move of taking back with your e pawn and promptly losing your bishop to that rook. Instead, there was a simple counter, which was to take with the knight and preserve advantage, and preserve also the solidity of the position. So there we are. Now my opponent does not give up, looking for a way through. So we have he's developing a new attack at this stage. Knight to e5. I think I've got time to take that pawn. I wasn't sure, but I thought, well, I believed I had time to take the pawn, and Lichess agrees. I was very pleased to see that Lichess approves of that nobbling of the b pawn. And so, yes, my opponent wants to link up his knights. Lichess recommends it in a different way, but this is how my opponent did it. Moves the knight from b6 to d7. I then, I'm pleased to say, saw the move that Lichess recommended. Bishop to b5. This is a nice strong diagonal to be on. It stops the knight from advancing, from moving, as the knight is now pinned to the rook. And also, we now have our eye on this a pawn. So pick up another pawn. The rook protects the knight, but this is a further weakening of the position. The position is gradually being worn down. I then pick up that extra pawn, and we have an advance of the black pawn to h5, at which point, as I mentioned earlier, I'm quite happy to swap off pieces at this stage. Lichess is recommending. Lichess recommends that I swap off pieces, which would be in accordance with what I was saying earlier. When you have a material and a positional advantage, then it makes sense to accept swappings off of pieces. Lichess recommends that I do that, but I didn't do that. I wanted to play a more positional game. At this stage, I moved my bishop down here, eyeing up this diagonal and this route through the pawn to the king. So that pawn needs to be defended, I would have thought, and the way to do it is to move your knight over to f6. That is what my opponent does. I then decide, I go back into swap off mode, swapping off the two big pieces, and on we go. It does activate the bishop, but I figure out that that's okay. I think that's going to be okay because I have the rook down the bottom there, rook, and I move him out to c1. I activate my rook, and the king gets active as well, the black king, but stays on that diagonal. So that pawn, the d5 pawn, is now crucial to the game. I begin to threaten an advance towards promotion. Bishop comes into d6. Knight hops up to c6. Now we have what looks like an attack, though it's a forlorn hope. I don't think it's even the march of the old guard at Waterloo, really. We have knight e to g4, looking for a way of getting in here. There is a possibility of trapping the king if I'm not careful. However, all it needed to stop in its tracks was a little g3, and that's that over and done with. The king comes down to e6 to protect the d5 pawn, and now we are approaching the end game. I pop down my knight to check the king, and you can see Lichess recommends that the king retreats either to d7 or e7, not f7, as that would keep it on that dodgy diagonal where the bishop is. However, my opponent, to his credit, was quite keen to try and build up an attack, and so he turns his king into a fighting king and brings him down here. But this leads into the jaws of checkmate, because it's possible here to create a mating net, and this is what I do. I don't worry about advancing my pawn now. I don't know why Lichess hasn't seen this, but this is what I do. I think it's a better move than what Lichess was recommending, if I may say so. Check the king, f4 check. Very pleased I found that move, and especially if Lichess didn't find it. King comes down to e4, and so perhaps the reason why Lichess wasn't recommending it is because the king and the knight are both attacking what is now my weak pawn. This is probably why Lichess did not like the idea of the f4 check, because it weakens this pawn. Before, the f2 pawn was defending both those pawns there. So it's quite a busy little pawn, but it was doing a sterling work of defense. However, this creates a situation where the e pawn is weakly defended. Now, I'll show you how things work out, and then we'll have a look at whether or not black could have gained anything by taking this e pawn. As things turned out, I defended the pawn with my rook, and what happened next? So I felt perhaps I had made a mistake in my move order, because suddenly this pawn is looking weak. However, and I should say at this stage, time was very limited. We both had, I think we had less than 5 minutes on the clocks at this stage. And so we're both moving quite quickly. And my opponent thought he would attack the rook. What he's seen, I think, is a possible route to kick the rook off this defensive file here. He's seen that he could perhaps bring his king down here. Bear in mind, though, my knight is actually defending this e2 square here. But here's what my opponent does. As if in preparation for such an idea, he brings his bishop down to attack my rook, hoping to kick my rook off e1, thereby possibly causing the e3 pawn to fall if all goes well for him. But what he hadn't seen is that this is a disaster. It is a disaster for black, because I simply have a move, which I am very pleased to say I saw, of bringing my bishop to c2. Now, I knew this would put the king in a very sticky position, but I hadn't quite realized how sticky it was. It is game over, because this square here is, of course, guarded by our wonderful d4 knight. The d4 knight is guarding f5 and f3. My wonderful f4 pawn is guarding e5. And so the king has nowhere to go, because he can't come down here. He can't take the pawn because the rook is guarding it. So it was just enough to create a mating net and checkmate. However, if we go back now, we'll see that my f4 checking move, we'll see why it wasn't recommended by Lichess. I got a bit excited earlier thinking I had out-Lichessed Lichess, but that would be a lie. So here, let's play it as, so we have check. Now let's play it as Lichess recommends. So the king comes down. What I'll do is I'll play my move and then see what Lichess says and see what kind of sticky situation we get ourselves into. Lichess recommends taking the pawn with the knight. Now, this does pin the knight to the king. So although it helps black, you see white still maintains a major advantage. And what we can do is move our knight back. All we've done is created ourselves a bit of trouble, but we are still maintaining a strong advantage. So we should still be, white should still be able to win this game. It'll just take rather longer than one would wish. And with time running out on our clocks, it would give black the possibility of a win on time, whipping out a time-based win from the jaws of defeat. So Lichess says to black, bring your pawn down. And we'll swap off here, and then we get kings into the action. And it becomes rather a long end game. However, the advantage does stay with white throughout. I won't play it all out, but the point is that had black seen at the end that my e3 pawn was rather weak, perhaps he could have avoided the checkmate and perhaps even won on time if I'd got stuck, because I was running out of time as well. I might have had to need to spend time thinking about what to do to maintain an advantage, having made that f4 checking move. But as it was, with a good bit of pub chess bluffery and a lack of time for anybody to think clearly, the whole thing worked well, and we achieved a rather pretty checkmate at the end of a highly entertaining game. So the lesson for today is really, during the opening stages of the game, pay close attention to your pawn structure, and pay attention to any holes that open up in your defense, and think about how you can prepare to defend them or avoid opening them up in the first place. Okay, folks, that's all from me, David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com, your pub chess bluffer, signing out on what's been a fine November day here in Hirama.